Welcome to Learn at Work, a webinar series presented by the journal Work, a journal of prevention, assessment, and rehabilitation. I'm Karen Jacobs. I'm the founding editor of Work, and I'm delighted to be the moderator of today's very interesting webinar. So I'm going to turn the webinar over to our speaker. So welcome.
Hey, good afternoon, Karen, and good afternoon, everyone, or I guess good morning, depending on where you are in the country. I want to thank Karen, Dr. Jacobs, for inviting me to give this talk. I was very honored to be on the line with you today to discuss career development and employment aspects of people with cystic fibrosis. This was my dissertation topic, and it's one that I'm very passionate about. I'd also like to thank my to Dr. Jamie Pomerantz and Dr. Mary Ellen Young. Just a little bit about my background. I'm a licensed counselor, and I have my PhD in rehabilitation science from the University of Florida. Currently, I work at Nemours Children's Specialty Care in Jacksonville, Florida. And Nemours is a very large subspecialty medical care provider. We have outpatient clinics in Jacksonville, Florida, and Pensacola, and Orlando. And we also have a hospital in Orlando. And we're also very big in the Northeast. If anyone is in that area, we have a hospital in Delaware, as well as outpatient clinics and primary care clinics throughout Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania area. So currently, I work directly with individuals with cystic fibrosis in a pediatric clinic, and I provide mental health counseling services and rehabilitation counseling services. And I've been a presenter at the North American Cystic Fibrosis Conference on topics of adulting with CF and employment issue people with CF. Just one thing, please don't be alarmed if you hear screaming, crying children in the background. My clinic, where children are getting allergy shot testing all day long, so it can get kind of loud around here. I apologize. And lastly, I just want to note that May is Cystic Fibrosis Awareness Month, so I'm especially glad that Dr. Jacobs invited me to give this talk this month so that I could raise awareness about this condition. And again, I thank everyone for tuning in and listening today. Oops, I'm sorry. I should have switched to that slide. So just a quick outline of my presentation. Today we're going to start with an introduction, an overview of cystic fibrosis and some of its manifestations. We're going to look at some background on employment concerns and barriers that people with cystic fibrosis experience. And I'd like to review some employment data with you. And then we'll look at the study itself and the objectives and the methods and so on, the research, look at the sample and some of the participant demographics and results. Then I'd like to talk to you about some strategies for minimizing employment barriers if you are currently helping people with cystic fibrosis. And if you're still with me at the end, I'd like to wrap up by discussing implications for practice as well and research. So by way of introduction, cystic fibrosis and its employment corollaries have really received very little attention in the research literature, despite the fact that complications of CF can present numerous barriers to optimal career outcomes. There seems to be a lasting impression that CF is solely a childhood illness, but that's no longer the case, as the median predicted age of survival now in CF is climbing steadily, and in fact is currently at approximately 44 years of age. It's been climbing very much so in the 2000s, and for reasons that I'll tell you in a little bit. One thing I wanted to point out too is very recently that individuals with CF in the United States, there's the majority now are age 18 or older, and this was a milestone that we hit about 3 years ago. So for the longest time, the population of CF was tilted towards the pediatric side because young people were not living that long with CF. But now we can happily say that the majority are actually 18 and older. So a little bit of background on cystic fibrosis. It is considered still a life-limiting or a life-shortening condition that affects about 30,000 children and adults in the United States. And in total around the world, it affects about 70,000 people worldwide. So it is something of a rare disease. CF is a genetically inherited condition, meaning that a person with CF must inherit a gene from their father's side and from their mother's side to have cystic fibrosis. And CF is caused by a defective gene, usually the delta F508 gene, that causes the body to produce thick, sticky mucus in the lungs and other organs that cannot be easily cleared. And this leads to really life-threatening lung infections and obstructs the pancreas such that people with CF generally can't absorb enough nutrition from their food. And again, the median predicted age of survival has now reached 44 years of age. So I wanted to show you some of the manifestations of CF. As you can see, it really affects numerous body systems. Primarily, CF is thought of as a lung disease, where it causes a number of damaging conditions. As you see in the pink box on the right side of your screen, CF can cause bronchiectasis, bronchitis, pneumonia, and pneumothorax are some of the more debilitating conditions that it can cause. But it also affects the GI system, especially because of malabsorption of nutrients in food, and that can lead to malnutrition. And as you can imagine, especially in infants and toddlers, malnutrition can be very bad as a child falls off the growth charts. It also affects reproductive organs, such that most males with CF are actually infertile. Although they do produce sperm, they just cannot release it because of this condition known as absence of the vas deferens. And in women, cystic fibrosis can make conceiving a child more difficult, and having an actual pregnancy can take a great toll on the body because of all the energy that's diverted to a developing fetus. CF can also affect the sinuses, causing sinusitis and polyps. It affects the liver and gallbladder and intestines, but primarily we think of it as a lung and GI disease. I would like to point out that not everyone will develop every one of these complications, and some of the complications are not seen to much later in life. So it really just depends. In the young adult population, it's generally lung involvement and GI involvement. So I'd like to say that living and working with CF is complicated, and even though mortality is improving significantly, morbidity is still high due to the progressive course of the disease that can really significantly interfere with labor market participation and career development. And in a moment, we'll look at some of those barriers, but just a couple of notes. So it's only recently that individuals with CF have been considered viable candidates to be referred for vocational rehabilitation, which is something, in other conditions, we kind of take that for granted, that we might refer a young person with sickle cell disease, for instance, to VR, or a young person with epilepsy to VR. But I did some research in this area and found that very few teens and young adults were actually been referred for rehab services because there was this idea that they weren't going to live long enough to benefit. Then there's a higher rate of unemployment among individuals with CF compared to the general population, and I'll show you a slide about that in a moment. And individuals with CF are actually at much higher risk for unemployment over time as the condition is progressive and gets more severe with age. So there are numerous theorized barriers to optimal employment and career development, as you can see here. So, for instance, people with CF will have frequent medical appointments. So the CF Foundation actually has recommendations around this. They have recommendations around many areas, but the recommendation is that folks come for minimum of 4 appointments per year. So in other words, on a quarterly basis for well visits. But oftentimes people with CF get sick very frequently, and so they wind up going to the doctor, the clinic, much more often than 4 times per year. And what else is notable about that is that appointments can last as long as half a day, because when someone with CF goes to a clinic appointment to see a physician, they're also going to see a nurse, they'll see a dietitian, they'll see a social worker, sometimes they will also see a pharmacist, sometimes a physician will send them for an x-ray. So before you know it, they've lost much of the day, which again is something that can interfere with school attendance or with work. Students with CF will miss school days or college classes due to feeling ill or having an exacerbation or for medical appointments. And we know that in CF there's numerous hospitalizations. And for example, in 2009, there were 14,000 hospitalizations with an average length of stay of about 9 days. And generally, hospitalizations last closer to 14 days, but 9 days was the average. And keeping in mind that someone with CF typically not just admitted once per year, but they can frequently be admitted upwards of 2 and 3 times per year. So you can see very quickly the number of days that someone is missing from work or from school can add up very quickly. And these absences, especially from school, have such a cumulative effect that very quickly a student can get behind the 8 ball and just not have a clue what's going on in class when they return. And that is a big challenge. Then there's the issue of recurrent pulmonary exacerbations. What a pulmonary exacerbation is, these are times that are characterized by, for example, a deterioration in lung function or lung infection, someone having increased cough and sputum production, or having weight loss. So essentially, these are times when people are just not feeling very well when they're in the midst of a pulmonary exacerbation. It may or may not, an exacerbation may or may not result in a hospitalization. Sometimes it does. Sometimes the physicians will try to do as much treatment at home with oral and IV antibiotics if possible. Lung function in CF, in adults with CF, averages about 64%. And what that means is someone with 64% is in what we call the moderate range of lung function. So we look at lung function in terms of mild, moderate, and severe. At 64, still they've lost quite a large amount of their lung function by the time they get down to 64%. And then we know that there's a extreme treatment burden in cystic fibrosis. So a daily CF care or routine can require about 2 to 3 hours of daily management that's very complex. So for instance, someone with CF has to do airway clearance during the day, which is getting on a machine called the vest, or having someone clap on them to help loosen mucus and bring it up. They have to do nebulized breathing treatments with antibiotics or mucolytic agents. And those are agents that they inhale that loosen the mucus so that they can then cough it up. They have to take numerous oral medications to treat the pulmonary and digestive complications. And on top of that, they have to do dietary supplement drinks and have large meals and snacks. So generally, all of these treatments need to be done either before work and after work. So again, you can see how this can cut into someone's day. It's especially detrimental for students. Sometimes not everyone is able to get early enough in the day to get all their treatments in. So sometimes they're late for school, which again adds to those cumulative delays. And then often students with CF will miss out on extracurricular activities because after school they have to rush home to do the rest of their treatment regimen, plus schoolwork and all those other kind of home activities. And finally, there's this issue of higher rates of anxiety and depression and cystic fibrosis. I would say it's about 3 or 4 years ago, the CF Foundation initiated an international study in anxiety and depression. And what they found is that young people and adults with CF were at higher risk of anxiety and depression. And they also did this study in caregivers, and they found that caregivers were experiencing symptoms, some degree of anxiety and depression. And as a result, international study, the foundation adopted the mantra that there's no health without mental health, and they adopted guidelines for screening all patients aged 12 and up for anxiety and depression once per year, and more often if indicated, and screening parents of children of any age at least annually for anxiety and depression. And so we've been able to really identify some people that needed extra help, because obviously if a patient is anxious or depressed, they may not be able to take optimal care of themselves. And the same thing for a parent of a child, they may not be taking optimal care of their child. So there is some good news in cystic fibrosis. It's not all doom and gloom. Survival has been improving, which is wonderful, and with improving survival, more young people are entering the world of work. So of the 30,000 folks in the U.S. with CF that I mentioned earlier, about 15,000 or closer to 16,000 adults with CF, 51% of them were maintaining some type of full-time or part-time employment. Actually, 38% were employed full-time and 12% were employed part-time. I'd just like to show you that another way. So I've been keeping track of employment trends for about the last 17 years, and that top line in the green you'll see is the overall employment rate. And for probably the last 10 years or so was below 50%. But in the last couple of years, it started to inch above the 50% mark, and that's very good. And I'll tell you my ideas about why I think that is in a moment. And then the blue line represents the percent of those employed full-time each year, which hovered around the 35-ish% mark. And the red line represents people working part-time, and that's been hovering steady around 10% and inching above the 10% line in the last few years. And this is likely due to the newer medications on the market and the fact that now more adults than ever are 18 and older. The other good news is that people with CF are really holding their own compared to others. So I did a comparison of people with CF against all individuals with disabilities, and I found that people with CF were working about 51% versus overall individuals with disability employment rate, which was about 37%. So they're not quite keeping up with their non-disabled peers, but I do think this is going to continue to improve. So I'd like to show you what is driving a lot of this improvement in life expectancy and leading to improved employment outcomes and higher employment rates. Here we see the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation's drug development pipeline, and CF is such a rare disease that for a long time the pharmaceutical industry ignored CF and did not really any interest in research and development as you would imagine for other populations. And so the CF Foundation a long time ago started doing something really neat. They started raising funds for cure and to put towards doing research of their own, and then contracting with pharmaceutical companies to do pharmaceutical research. So here you see a bunch of medications that are now available to patients thanks to the foundation's great advocacy for attention to the disease. So CF is not cured yet, but there's a saying in the CF community that one day the letters CF will no longer stand for cystic fibrosis, for cystic fibrosis, but rather that someday they'll stand for cure found. Current treatment was mostly directed at the symptoms, but the newest medications are targeted at correcting the underlying genetic defects. So this is really state-of-the-art treatment. The medications known as CFTR modulators, they're the ones you see here on the left in the purple. These modulators act as correctors for the CF gene, and they don't completely correct the defect that caused by the CF gene, but they correct it enough to have a very good improvement on lung function. So the three that are available to patients today are Lidico, Orkambi, and Symdeko. And as you can see there, there's more drugs coming up in the pipeline that are getting to phase 3 testing trials. So that's very good news. Other treatments for CF consist of mucociliary clearance, and these are the drugs known as Pulmozyme and hypertonic saline. And essentially what Pulmozyme and hypertonic saline do is these are inhaled medications, and they act to loosen the mucus in the lungs so they get deep into the airways, loosen the mucus, and then allow the patient to cough it up through airway clearance or getting on a machine known as the vest that vibrates the lungs and helps them to cough up mucus. And then some other treatments for CF are anti-inflammatories help a little bit. There's a vast array of antibiotics that help because there are many, I haven't really gone into it, but there are many types of lung infections that accelerate lung damage, such as B. cepacia or Pseudomonas. So these are some of the antibiotics. And then there's a lot of nutritional and GI medications. Primarily, there's great concern for vitamins because people with CF are not able to absorb nutrients from food, so they're often vitamin deficient. So Aquadex is a vitamin that's water soluble and easily absorbed by patients. And then there's a variety of enzymes that patients can take. And what pancreatic enzymes do is help patients to digest more nutrients from their food. And finally, there's Relizorb, which is used specifically in patients that have a G-tube, and it helps them to process the enzymes through the G-tube more effectively. So I just want to show you some of what's driving all these improvements. So I'm going to turn my attention now towards the study objectives. So essentially, the study looked to achieve a really deep and rich understanding of work and employment experiences of people with CF using the grounded theory method. And the study was novel for two reasons. First, there's really scant qualitative research on employment in CF. And second, there was none utilizing the grounded theory method. So here's the method section. The study used grounded theory, which is really the leading method of qualitative inquiry today. And essentially, if you're not familiar with grounded theory, essentially what it means is that you develop a theory grounded in the data. So they say that you go up from the data. And grounded theory is especially appropriate for this project because there's limited no prior information available in the area. So I conducted a purposive sample of 10 young adults with CF who participated in in-depth semi-structured qualitative interviews, which were about 30 to 60 minutes long, roughly. And I then analyzed the interview transcripts following the constant comparative approach to coding, which identified some core themes and sub-themes, and then resulted in an ecological framework that I'm about to show you. And in case you're curious, I also used, if you're familiar with in vivo software, So I used that to, after the transcripts were transcribed verbatim, then I used in vivo to assist with the coding part of it. So the specific fourfold. The first was to gain really, again, a deep understanding of the meaning of work to emerging adults with CF. In other words, emerging adults is young adults specifically. Secondly, to give a voice to young adults with CF to discover how the illness has influenced their employment aspirations. And thirdly, to identify and describe the employment experience of young adults with CF. And finally, to understand and identify the process of career development in young adults with cystic fibrosis. And a sample of 10 individuals with CF who participated in really in-depth, semi-structured interviews that ranged in length from about 30 to 60 minutes roughly to explore their work experiences and career development process. The sample was comprised of 6 females and 4 males who ranged in age from 18 to 27, but most of them were in their early 20s. And the participants were adults who were working in paid employment that was either full or part-time, who had work experience in the last 12 months. So here you see some of the participant demographics. I did assign pseudonyms to everyone, and I did that to protect their privacy for publication. Efforts were taken to include diversity in the age and the gender, disease severity, education and work experience. And again, in terms of disease severity, it was also important to look at people with mild, moderate, and severe disease to have a good understanding of each person's process. And you'll see here that the participants had a mix of full and part-time work experiences and varying educational levels from high school degree to some with college, and a couple that even had already earned their bachelor's degrees. So out of all these qualitative interviews, 4 broad themes about employment and career development, were identified from an analysis of the qualitative interviews. So the first was that work is therapeutic for people with CF. The second was that there is an influence of CF on employment and career development. The third was that work was influential or important for their success. The work environment was influential for their success. And finally, two patterns of career development emerged, which we'll look at in a moment. And from all of this, you'll see in a moment, was represented in an ecologically based model. So turning to the theme, the first theme that emerged was this idea that work is therapeutic. So work was considered therapeutic by all the participants, and I would say this is actually true for anyone, not just folks with CF, but participants identified really beneficial themes to work, especially around having a purpose and economic independence. And beyond that kind of significant meaning of employment, the participants described the psychosocial benefits they experienced by working, such as the daily structure, the satisfaction, feeling of satisfaction, and feeling of being productive and productivity, and having a sense of belonging somewhere, belonging to their work group. And then the next theme that emerged is about the influence of CF on employment, and it played out in these sub-themes. So the sub-themes stood out in their effect on career development and work experiences were this idea of altruism, persistence, downplaying CF, and occupational compromise. So In terms of the influence of healthcare providers, this was interesting because parents, all the participants did discuss their parents, but what they said was that parents definitely encouraged post-secondary education or school and working, but nothing really specific came of that. But they felt that healthcare providers seemed more influential than parents, so healthcare providers seemed to serve as role models for them. And this is probably due to the high level of exposure to the healthcare system that young people with CF have. And then in terms of occupational compromise, these were compromises that young people had to make in terms of maybe cutting back their hours to accommodate their treatment schedule, or to get more rest, because rest is very important in cystic fibrosis. Some had to change employment because it was too taxing for them. Some even had to change their career aspirations because they realized that, for instance, a certain career path might be too taxing. For example, one participant, Hal, had very smart young man, was tracking towards medical school, but after getting into that, realized that the demands of medical school and fellowship were probably going to be too much for him, and he kind of did a course correction and went more towards psychology, and in fact was working towards his PhD. So that he made that occupational compromise, but it worked for him. And finally, in terms of occupational compromise, there's also an avoidance of infection. So folks were making choices in employment based on possible potential exposure to infections or airway irritants. Then there's this idea of downplaying CF. So that was a pattern where participants were de-emphasizing the significance of CF on their career and their life. In terms of altruism, it was interesting because 9 out of the 10 participants expressed a desire to pursue a career where they could be of service to others. And again, I associate that a little bit with exposure to the health professions. And in terms of persistence, all of the participants showed kind of like a dogged persistence in pursuing and achieving their school and work-related goals. And finally, what was interesting is that participants, even with very severe disease, continued to work or had a desire to return to work if they had left and they considered their leaving temporary. So next we see the theme of environment. And here participants identified 3 essential areas of their work lives, being employer and coworker support, disease disclosure, and workplace concerns. And generally, the experience with work by all the participants was very positive. And all the participants in the study had either work experience were working at the time or 2 that had recent experience. And every participant but one perceived support from their superiors and their coworkers. And this is very essential because having supportive supervisors and coworkers is really crucial for maintaining employment and also for obtaining needed accommodations on the job. So in terms of disease disclosure, this was interesting because the attitudes towards disclosing CF were mixed. 6 of the participants were very open about disclosing their condition, while 4 had a tendency towards being more guarded about disclosing. And the reasons for disclosing or not disclosing varied. Some individuals with an openness towards disclosure noted kind of like a feeling of empowerment, and they disavowed having any shame, while those that were more guarded expressed wanting to maintain their privacy, and they voiced concerns, related to disability discrimination. And then within the workplace or workplace concerns, participants expressed concerns about demands, job demands, I should say, and the work environment. For them, it was important to have certain accommodations, for instance, flexible scheduling, ability to take some rest breaks, ability to take medication at work, and perform treatments at work sometimes. So in the work environment, it was also helpful for them to have access, close access to bathrooms and avoid airway irritants and avoid the risk for infection as well. So now we have the theme of career development. And here, what I observed was that two patterns emerged. First was an uninterrupted pattern that was characterized by kind of an orderly pattern of career development, kind of like you see here represented in the picture, just kind of a nice straight line. So CF has the potential to influence career development outcomes as evidenced by these patterns I labeled interrupted and uninterrupted patterns. 5 participants, and they all had less severe disease, shared a common pattern of career development, which was uninterrupted school attendance or high school attendance, getting an after-school job or summer job, high school graduation, and then later enrolling in post-secondary education or entering the labor force. So much like you would imagine a typical teen progressing through a career development pattern. But in the uninterrupted pattern, 5 participants living with more severe disease described this common pattern of career development, and one that was really marked by disruption and interruption, kind of like you see in this picture here, zigging and zagging, if you will. Excuse me. So this was related to frequent illnesses related and resulting school absences, having to enroll in hospital homebound education for support and taking schoolwork home, having schoolwork at home, withdrawing, excuse me, from post-secondary education for illness-related reasons, and even losing employment for illness-related reasons. So all of these themes kind of combine together to form this ecological model that you see here. This is where it all came together. So there's an interplay and an influence of these variables. So individual characteristics and that personal context incorporate physical and psychological attributes of the person, such as race and gender and so on. So what you see here in the bottom circle are the individual characteristics of the person, their disease severity in terms of mild, moderate, or severe, their gender, and kind of like their attitude towards life, their illness appraisal, their persistence, their altruism. And this interacts with their personal context, their parents' influence, their educational experiences, healthcare system involvement, and their degree of treatment burden. So career development patterns will vary based on all these physical and psychological characteristics of the person and the physical attributes of their age and gender and disease severity. And these accounted for some of the variation in the two patterns that emerged, but there was some other variables and aspects such as the work environment, employer support, and disease disclosure that were mediating factors, if you will. And the result of all these complex interactions are the two patterns that you see here, the uninterrupted and interrupted pattern. So turning to some of the key points, individuals with CF and really many individuals with disabilities in general are overlooked in career development research. And especially in the arena of CF, there's insufficient research on CF and employment. And CF is a risk factor for optimal career development. But work is therapeutic for individuals with CF, and work disability was not universal. Out of the participants in this study, only 2 were actually had gone on SSI. SSI, excuse me. But one notable thing is that disease severity is associated with educational status. So if a younger person had more severe disease resulting in many more days missed from school, this did derail their education quite a bit, both in high school, delaying high school graduation, and in some cases derailing college or post-secondary pursuits. Just some more key points. So individuals with CF do seem to place the same value on work as their healthy peers. Again, this is in spite of their disease. And CF does impart unique sets of conditions that may influence their choosing and getting and keeping employment. But the presence of CF alone didn't really guarantee that individuals would experience negative effects on employment or career development. Again, I think it has a lot to do with the mediating factors like their persistence, their occupational compromises, and so on. So some recommendations or ways that folks can help people with CF to minimize their employment barriers. These include instruction, so helping them identify potential careers, especially careers that will not exacerbate their illness, helping them with interpersonal skills. So often that I think of that as a lot of coaching, like for instance, how do I communicate with my boss? How do I communicate with my coworkers? How do I disclose my condition or accommodations I need? Helping or coaching with problem solving skills. So for instance, what to do if, and fill in the blank here. So what to do if I have an exacerbation, or what to do if I know I'm going to be admitted to the hospital, and that kind of thing. What to do if I need to call out sick for a few days. And then in terms of coaching around self-advocacy skills, so what do I need and how do I get it? Oftentimes, young people are not the best advocates for themselves. It's very helpful to have parents that will kind of guide them. But for instance, issues around qualifying for FMLA, or issues around getting break periods or rest periods. And finally, education, because promoting higher levels of education leads to better jobs and better insurance. So that's very helpful. So I do try to educate the young adults that I work with, especially around services available in post-secondary education, for instance, tutoring services and services available from disability resource centers and vocational rehabilitation, and those kinds of things are really helpful. And then thinking in terms of implications for future studies. So there really would be benefited, the research literature would benefit from larger studies with more diverse samples. Unfortunately, where I'm based in Northeast Florida, the population of people with CF is primarily Caucasian, although cystic fibrosis does affect some people of African American descent and Asian descent. It's not as great. I believe the last statistic I heard is about 97% of the CF population is Caucasian, though it does affect other groups. And then I think that continuing testing this grounded theory, the ecological model that was observed, and kind of testing that out. And finally, and something that I'm very interested in, is to follow up this study with parent and employer interviews. My study was limited just to patients, but I'm very interested in hearing parents' views of their child's career development and any disruptions and so on. And I'd also be interested in talking to employers and learning their perceptions of employees with cystic fibrosis. And then turning to implications for practice, I think that CF centers, rehabilitation counselors, and educators can all play a big role in assisting people with CF to reach their career and employment goals. Everyone, for instance, can encourage secondary education, and CF centers can assist with identifying compatible careers. Rehabilitation counselors can assist with the process of choosing, getting, and keeping employment. And teachers can assist with smoothing the way for school to work transition or school to area transition, for instance. And finally, just some conclusions. We know that, again, there's complicated interaction among all these numerous ecological variables that can result in different patterns of career development. The presence of CF alone didn't guarantee negative effects on career development. And again, the idea that rehabilitation counselors, education professionals, teachers, and school social workers and CF clinic staff can all facilitate career planning and employment, because I like to think that it takes a village to help a person with CF. I'd like to thank you for tuning in today. I want to thank Dr. Jacobs again for inviting me, and I thank the audience for joining the webinar today.
Thank you so very much. This was so interesting. And this is a population that I really have had no experience working with. How would you advise people who are new to working with clients with this diagnosis to begin to get to know more about it? Your webinar is fabulous. I can think of one.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah, it was great, so informative. Can you, how can we get to better understand?
Well, I think one of the things that they teach you as a rehabilitation counselor is that to have understanding of people with disabilities, you need contact, kind of personal contact, and in fact, lack of contact is leading reasons that there's so many misunderstandings and about helping people with disabilities. So there's a few really wonderful ways that you can learn more about CF and get involved with the CF community. And probably my best recommendation in that area is to get on to the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation's website, which is www.cff.org. And there's really a wonderful information on there for people from all different disciplines that you can read about. So there's general reading on that website. Then there's information for researchers, information for teachers, for vocational counselors, and so on. And then the other thing that's fantastic about the website is that folks can get involved with Great Strides and events to help people with CF. So Great Strides is an event that occurs in May, and it's our big fundraiser for the foundation. But it's where families of children with CF and patients themselves get together to do fundraising walks. But they start the walks with some great talks and just very friendly community to go out and get to know, and just literally walk up to people and ask them about their experience. When I first started working with the CF community, people with CF were actually my best teachers. But you can read so much. There's some wonderful textbooks and so on that you can read, but really just trying to get to know folks and learn their personal experience is probably my best advice.
Yes, so the lived experience, the narratives are so important. That's why we were so happy to publish your article and work, because I think CF is a population that many people don't know about, but that there's much potential in helping individuals with CF be able to have meaningful lives. I was thinking of one resource, and you may be familiar with it. It's the Job Accommodation Network, and in West
Yes.
Virginia, and Ask Jan, AskJan.org.
Mm-hmm.
A fabulous resource for people who may be beginning to work with someone with CF and maybe needs to have some other questions answered regarding reasonable accommodations, particularly for
Yes.
going to.
So can I tell you, Karen, I think that JAN, Job Accommodation Network, is a great resource in general. But would you know that CF is not listed there? They don't have very many specific recommendations. You know how for different conditions they have fact sheets and information. CF is, last time I looked, it was lumped under, I think, general like respiratory conditions, but they didn't have very much specific information. And some of the recommendations that are applicable to other respiratory conditions also are applicable to CF, but I actually had contacted them about 10 years ago and was emailing with someone about developing a CF handout, and we never seem to get anywhere.
You know, we have to
but
never give up, right?
No, this is true. No, you're right. You're absolutely right.
But that's really interesting because I use the job accommodation quite a bit. So I think doing some advocacy, you know, with helping and maybe helping to create some of the resources would be fabulous. So we're going to conclude. Any thoughts, Pablo, that you?
No, I just wanted to tell you there's a wonderful text by Dr. Orenstein, David Orenstein. It's just called Cystic Fibrosis, A Guide for Patient and Family, and I believe it's in the 4th edition now, and that is a great resource if folks are looking for really detailed information aside from the CF Foundation.
Yeah, and you know, that's something for us to absolutely keep in mind to make sure that we know more. But I loved your example of the lived experience, really getting to understand someone who is living with CF and their caregivers as well. We can't forget. So we're going to conclude.
Right.
Do you have any last thoughts about, you know, your research? You talked about new directions that you're going to go into. Any last thoughts for our listeners before we conclude?
No, I'd just like to say that the next evolution of this study is going to be to incorporate parents and employers. So I might reach out to your listserv someday. And I really would be interested in doing a more national study, and I hope that maybe I can get some assistance in recruiting participants from around the country.
That would be great. We'll be very happy to help you, and we hope once your study is completed, you'll submit it as a manuscript to work and do another Learn at Work webinar in the future.
Oh, that would be great.
So thank you so much, and we really appreciate you taking the time to do this, and for our listeners too. Did you have one more thought you wanted to share?
No, I just really wanted to sincerely thank you and sincerely thank everyone who tuned in or who watched the video on your YouTube channel, because it's really important that folks get familiar with cystic fibrosis, and I hope that folks reach out to the foundation and get involved in any way that they can.
That's great. And do you want to share your email just in case someone wants to reach out to you?
So my email is just my first initial and last name. So it's P like Pablo, and then S as in Sam, ALDANA @nemours.org. And Nemours is spelled NEMOURS. So psaldana@nemours.org.
Great. Thank you so much again for being with us.
Thank you, Karen, and thanks everyone out there.